Morning, or I guess it's afternoon actually. All right, good afternoon, good morning, I don't know, good evening wherever you are. I decided to do an impromptu live stream outside of the normal one today because I wanted to talk about the ongoing work that I'm doing with shame and forgiveness via my internal work and how the qigong movements that I'm doing are allowing me to go deeper and discover these very embedded and embodied blockages within myself that really just need to go. Um, but why this process is necessarily a slow and careful one that must be worked with because of the stuff that comes up when you do internal work. So here we are, and I'm gonna just go ahead and do it. So So a few weeks ago, to give you a little context here, I took a class on Gods Playing in the Clouds, Qigong, where I learned movements 1, 2, and 4. You might say, well, 1, 2, and 4? Why not 3? Well, according to the teacher, 3 is really complicated. And it was an awesome and amazing experience. It really helped me reach a level of depth with my internal work and with just working with chi that I had not reached before. And I've been doing this work every day since then. And in fact, I actually have signed up for another class in a couple weeks called Cloud Hands, which works with chronic physical illness. But I'm taking it just because I'm curious to see what else can be done with it, and because I also use Qigong for healing purposes. So that's one of my interesting things about it. And I'm taking some further courses. So, how does this relate to the internal work? Well, as a result of doing this work, I have been finding that as I'm doing it, and I'm doing these physical movements and working with the underworld and stellar cosmos energies as well as my own energy, that what's happening is that I'm going deeper into myself and I'm finding these embedded blockages that are really deep around shame and rejection and other things along those lines, and it's helping me to see past relationships and current relationships and really just myself in a very different light. It's a good light. It's a hard light at the same time. I mean, that, I talked last time about how internal work is hard, and this is really a good example of that, because when you're doing internal work around your blockages, around the things that are embedded within you, stuff is going to come up, because what are you doing? You're purposely choosing to poke the beast. You're purposely ripping the band-aid off, and you're encountering the deeper set emotions and things like that have been frozen away. And they've been frozen because, I mean, one of the learning mechanisms that we learn, all of us to some degree or another, is we learn to repress our emotions. We learn to block out the things that make us squirmy and uncomfortable. I mean, I certainly learned that early on in my life. I learned that I was not allowed to express my emotions, and I ended up bottling up a lot of anger and rage and other things, because I was basically, if I expressed those emotions, I'd end up getting a beating, or I'd end up being told what a disappointment I was. And since that happened on a fairly regular basis to some degree or another anyway, it really reinforced, that thing. Now, the blockages that I'm dealing with right now are more, in some ways, more recent ones. They're really around the relationships that I've had in my life with other people that have been romantic, and really, what I've come to recognize is how my issues and the other person's issues would basically create a vicious circle between each other, right? And so what would end up happening is both people, or more people, if there were more people were involved, would end up getting hurt, because what would happen is that, this issue here would get triggered, and so what would happen is a reaction would occur. And in my case, I'll use the example of the reaction being, in my case, the reaction being looking for, feeling rejected by the person, feeling like I wasn't really important or wanted, and then consequently going out and trying to find other people, and then kind of rinsing and repeating throughout that process. Add into that other issues as well, and what you end up getting is you get this really toxic mess where you have your issue triggered and you trigger the other person's issue, and then the other person's issue triggers your issue, and you have this vicious circle where you're continually hurting each other. And this isn't resolved unless you learn how to do a few different things. One of the things is that you do the necessary internal work where you recognize, like, okay, here's my issue, and here's what the underlying narrative is, and here's why I'm doing this. And then the other thing is that the other person has to also recognize on their end what their issue is. But then you also have to necessarily have that conscious level of communication where you're talking you're very much able to kind of step back as best as possible from your reactions and say, okay, here's what's going on. And let's be honest here, we're not really taught how to do that in relationships. I mean, maybe you end up going to a therapist and they help you somewhat. For myself, what I found really ended up helping me in the current relationship that I'm in is that at the very beginning of the relationship, even with some of the mistakes that were being made on my part, one of the right things that I did is I said, let's sit down and read some different books on relationships and love and other things together, and let's read through these things and talk about them. And doing that really helped with that piece of things, because it helped give us some tools for how to consciously communicate with each other and how to label and recognize, okay, this is what's going on here and this is why that's happening. What can we do to step back and, as little as possible, react? And let's be honest here, you're always going to react to some degree, especially in a charged situation when you're talking about things that are hard to deal with. There's always going to be that level of reaction, and that's okay. We have to make space for and acknowledge the reactions that we have. Reactions are not bad things, they just are part of who and what we are. When we can recognize those reactions, though, that's when we can start to do that internal work to discover what the narrative is and what the blockages are, because inevitably there are blockages around the reactions that we have. You don't react without reason. You react because you had a situation occur and you recognized and learned, you recognized a way to handle it. It wasn't necessarily the best way, but it was the best way you knew at the time, and that became your reaction. And then after that, you came up with other you continued that reaction because that was the best way you knew how. Now, the issue is that reaction continuing to be the best way? And the answer is usually not. And if it is the best way, it's still worthwhile to really examine and figure out, well, why is that the best way? And that's where this conscious awareness comes into play. But when we're doing internal work, our internal work is allowing us to go past even the conscious mind filters, go past the unconscious filters, and go into this deeper underlying narrative and discover what's really going on. So when I've been doing my internal work lately, I've been doing it around shame and around rejection and around other related things. And what I've been finding is that this internal work has really helped me start processing my shame in a different way. Because, see, I've used my shame as a way to beat myself up. Like, okay, I did this, this, and this, and so pummel, 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 pummel. Well, that's not really a healthy way to go through life. It doesn't resolve the issue all that well. And really what it ends up doing is it actually makes it front and center of any conversation that's going to be had around it. I don't know about you, but when something becomes front and center of a conversation, it tends to take up all the emotional space, all the emotional time, everything else, and it becomes very exhausting to deal with, and it makes it very hard to progress. It creates a blockage within the relationship as well as within yourself and within the other person. So, in my case, doing this internal work around shame is really proving to be very liberating, because one of the things that I'm starting to do is starting to forgive myself and let go of the shame, so that instead of beating myself up, I'm saying, look, I forgive you. Yes, you did X, and yes, you should be accountable and responsible for that. Like, I want to be very clear about that. I don't really buy into the Christian notion of forgiveness, which I think perfectly embodies this notion of giving away accountability and responsibility. Like, you'll be forgiven all your sins. Okay, great. Now you're saved. Well, that's nice, but what about the accountability and responsibility part of it? I don't think Christianity's notion of forgiveness has ever really dealt with that, or maybe it has and I'm just not seeing it. Fair enough. I'll own that. But my own experience around forgiveness is that if I'm going to forgive myself, let alone anyone else, I need to see some level of accountability and responsibility on the part of whoever. I need to know that that person acknowledges and understands, like, here's what you did, here's what I did. And not in a punishing, judgy kind of way, but just more of a, yes, I take responsibility for these things. Now, the thing is there's this very delicate balance with that, because on the one, there's that aspect of it, but then there's that tendency as well where you're kind of like, well, I'm going to beat myself up. And that's where the judgy aspect comes into play. Or I'm going to beat you up. Like, yeah, I'll forgive you, but you da da da. No, I want to be very clear here. When we're talking about taking responsibility and accountability for ourselves, it's being able to own it in a way where you are confident enough to say, yes, this is what happened, and I accept it and own it, and I choose to learn from it and move forward and know that I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z ever again, because I recognize the harm that it can cause to myself and to other people. I recognize that. And yet I don't need to beat myself up anymore about it. I don't need to repeat the cycle. And I find really, like with shame, that shame tends to be a repeat. There's a difference between shame and guilt. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I recognize I did this bad thing. Shame is harder to deal with, because if we're told that we're inherently sinful beings or that we're inherently wrong, well, then no matter what you do, it's never going to be right. You're never going to be good enough. That makes it really hard to make changes. And I think that's really where the key piece lies when we discuss taking responsibility for ourselves, is that we're not, and accountability is that we're choosing to very purposely acknowledge and recognize, here's where here's where I did something wrong, and I'm not going to do that again. But I am not inherently wrong in myself. And so that's where we begin to transform shame into something else, into guilt perhaps, but perhaps even more importantly, maybe into conscious learning and awareness, and being able to transcend and let it go at that point, because instead of letting shame define us, we're choosing to say, yeah, I'm not a bad person. Yes, I chose to do this thing, and that wasn't good, and I came off as an asshole, and I was an asshole then, or whatever. But I'm choosing not to be that way anymore. I am choosing to make a responsible choice, an accountable choice. And I'm letting go of my own shame and the pain that underlies it. Because with shame, there's also pain. Right? I mean, the very feeling of shame, at least in my experience, is one that is painful. It is suffering. Well, I don't want to suffer. I don't imagine any of us really wants to suffer. the key is that the key to letting go of that suffering is that we have to first acknowledge that we are suffering in the first place. And when we repress things, when we push stuff down like shame, what we're really doing is we're causing ourselves to ignore something fundamental about our experience, and so we're not really embracing or learning from it. Instead, we're just repressing it and burying it and freezing it. So in my case, these last few weeks have been hard, but they've been good for me because I'm really unlocking some deeper parts of myself that need to be unlocked and worked with, and that I hope, no, that I know, that I know make me a better person, because I'm no longer holding on to this notion of I'm a bad person because of X. Instead, I'm saying I take responsibility and accountability for X, and I choose to learn from it and move forward. And I'm not going to beat myself up anymore. And this is why internal work is so important, because if we don't do this work, we don't progress. Instead, we self-sabotage. Instead, we replicate. Instead, we create the very experiences that we're trying to get away from because we haven't learned our lesson from them. And that's really why we need to learn those lessons. But we learn it by taking that crucial step of saying, I accept responsibility and accountability for this, and I choose to learn from it. I also choose to forgive myself and stop beating myself up. I choose to stop holding myself in shame. Instead, I choose to wholly embrace and take on this new consciousness, this new approach. And that's where things start to transform. And you see changes in behavior. You see changes in patterns. You see deeper relationships. You see something that's ongoing and beautiful and amazing within yourself and with the people that you choose to share it with in your life. And your conversations become easier because you're no longer fighting each other. You're no longer struggling against each other. Instead, you're choosing to truly embrace and accept who and what you are to each other, and choosing to become better people. And that's what we want at the end of the day, I think. It's what I want anyway. I want to become a better person. And a better person is a subjective thing, but I think at least in my case, what it boils down to is I want to become somebody, I am becoming somebody who treats people better because I recognize and see my issues and how they intersect with other people's issues. And instead of continuing that intersection, I choose to break my part of it, and change that part and show up in a different way. So I just wanted to share that with you. It kind of builds off the previous stuff. I know I've been on a bit of a series around this, but it's because I think internal work is so important and not enough people do it. You know, we live in a society and a culture, at least in the US, that's not very introspective. It's very self-absorbed and very me-focused. I mean, you see that right now in the protests and everything, where people are so fixated on having their freedom instead of saying, well, how is this going to impact other people? How is me going out there without a mask or whatever else going to impact other people? What's going to happen? And I think in a way, really, this is a commentary on American culture here, but I think really in a way, the thing that stands out to me about American culture in particular is that we aren't very good at handling our own sense of shame. And so we become very entitled and me-focused because it's about burying away those things we don't want to see about ourselves. Well, that's where this internal work comes into play. And maybe this is true the world over. I don't know, because I haven't lived in other countries long enough, for any length of time where I could speak to that culture or whatever else. I can only speak to what my experience is, and even then, I'm really only speaking to my experience as a white male who's very privileged, etc., etc. That's that's where I'm speaking from. But I hope that what I share is of value to you, and thank you for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend.